Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Ricci, the Director of Alumni Relations and Engagement for the School of Arts and Sciences. I would like to welcome you to today's Scarlet speaker event. If this is your first one, I would like to welcome you, and if you are returning, I would like to welcome you back. As a reminder, we've muted everyone's cameras, or we've muted everyone's microphones and turned off your cameras so that there's no disruption during the event. We ask that you use the Q&A feature to submit any questions you may have, and we'll be able to answer them at the end of the presentation. This event is also being recorded, so if you have somebody who you think might enjoy it after the fact, we'll send you the link and you could pass it along. And as a reminder, these events are not just for Rutgers alums, so if you ever get an invitation and you know someone who you think would be interested, by all means, please forward the invitation. Now I would like to welcome today's speaker, Michael Rossi. Michael is a Rutgers Graduate School alum and an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers. His research focuses on democracy and development in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and he has published in Nationalities Papers, the Czech Journal of Political Science, Foreign Policy, European Politics and Policy, and Balkan Insight. Today's talk will focus on what does American foreign policy look like in 2021 under a Biden administration. Is America truly back, as Biden says, or does the United States have to contend with rising global powers like China, Russia, and Iran? From Afghanistan to Syria and from Ukraine to North Korea, the United States remains a major global power, but a power that needs to cooperate with at least one other major power in a new multipolar world. This talk will address what that means for America's national interests around the world, the future of democracy and human rights, and the limits and capabilities of what the United States can do for the foreseeable future. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Michael Rossi.
Thank you very much, Dana, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. This is my first time participating in the Rutgers Scarlet speaker series, and I hope that the next 30 to 45 minutes can really provide some interesting insight, which I'm happy to take some questions, answers, comments afterwards. So let me just go ahead here and share my screen. So as the title indicates, right, we are sort of talking about the end of what we in the academic world and the policy world sort of euphemistically refer to as the end of Pax Americana. And in this sense, I'm looking really at the United States operating definitively, not just in a multilateral world, but in a multipolar. And obviously, just within the last couple of months, there has been a number of events that have happened around the world that have really put the question of America's global hegemony as a superpower to the test. Obviously, from the image that you see here, this is sort of, it's an editorial prior to President Biden assuming power in the White House. And, there was this sense that Donald Trump's foreign policy, specifically the ideology of America first, was risking America's position as a global leader in the world. I contend that Trump's America first platform isn't necessarily a threat to America's global supremacy so much as it was a symptom of America's declining global presence. And pretty much since one could effectively say since the 2008-2009 economic crisis, but really beginning, one would say, about 20 years ago with the 9/11 attacks and the gradual diminishing of America's image around the world through the global war on terror. Now, obviously, within the last year or so, right, we have experienced a number of global challenges, not just to U.S. power around the world, but just simply to global security, global stability. The fact that we are talking here virtually as opposed to in person has a lot to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. The fact that academia, schools, high schools, elementary schools are now being operated online, right, is all indicative of the pandemic virus that has affected us. And by last count, I believe, The number of deaths in the United States just to COVID has now surpassed the levels of deaths in the 1918 flu pandemic. To that, we also note the rising, literally the rising temperature around the world, the threat of climate change, the threat of environmental catastrophe. All of this has not just weakened America's global position, but has, clearly indicated that there is no one country that can handle, tackle, control, regulate something as pandemic, as transnational, as either a virus or climate change. Global terrorism is also, a continuing threat. And with the collapse of the U.S. Supported government in Afghanistan about a month or so ago, and the Taliban effectively seizing control of Kabul before American troops had even withdrawn from the country, gives pause to the assumption that Afghanistan may very well become another safe haven for global terrorism in the near future. We already have seen attacks on U.S. troops and Afghan civilians from sort of the new incantation of the Islamic State. And, there is no indication that global terrorism is going to subside in the years and months to follow. Beyond just these transnational challenges, we also have rising powers in the world, chief of which most people will find no argument with is China. China's expanding global presence is less of a militaristic one and more of an economic. China's One Belt, One Road policy is really sort of the major infrastructural blueprints for China's economic, political, diplomatic presence, not just through Central Asia, but really, linking up many markets in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, areas in which the United States is really just playing catch up, if not being caught off guard by not taking, seriously enough. And then, of course, we also have the continued rise of powers like Russia, which achieved a major diplomatic victory, not just in the defense and the support of the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but has kind of used the Syrian civil war as a foothold for establishing its own diplomatic presence in the Middle East. Right? This is no longer an area that is monopolized by U.S. diplomatic interests. So obviously, here we are in 2021. It's fair enough to say that the last 2 decades or so have certainly witnessed a significant decline in American global presence, global hegemony. And, I'm here to say that this is not the result of any one blunderous mistake, or it's not Donald Trump's fault. It's not Joe Biden's fault. It's not Barack Obama's fault. It is unfortunately just an inevitable series of events that has, reminded us that the United States' position as a global superpower was really on borrowed time. And I think that the definitive end to any notion of American global super supremacy here was the fateful image, right, of the helicopters flying away from the American embassy in Kabul, which is reminiscent of the last time the United States had sort of lost major, image relations in the public eye with Saigon about 40 to 50 years ago. So, with all of that said, right, this is just a brief overview of where we are in 2021. And, the basic understanding, if we were to take sort of a snapshot of the world today, all of the, examples that I've given you here gives pause to a couple of reflections. And the first is that, especially with the 3 main challenges to global stability and security, COVID, global warming, and global terror, there is not one state, right? There's not one power alone that possesses the authority, the capability to solve any one of these issues alone. So it's not that if the United States is global power is going to be replaced by China, that China will somehow be able to solve all of that, right? That's not the case at all. So this kind of gives us a little bit of a reassurance that the decline of American global supremacy isn't due to it being replaced by another power, but just simply that the problems of the world today are transnational, and they require transnational cooperation, right? So in that sense, no one state has the power, the capability, the clout in order to do that. To that, however, what I can say is that if America's global presence has declined over the past 20 years, there is some parting gift to understand that the United States will remain a major power. And if the world's power systems are rebalancing away from, let's say, a unipolar presence, it is gravitating towards what we can call a multipolar system, or even more so, lopsided multipolarities, right? In which case, there's somewhere between, let's say, 4 or 5 countries, 4 or 5 powers in the world, right, that will leave their mark on global development. But all of them are competing in some way with the United States, which is a power within this multipolar alignment, but still remains comparatively stronger than any one of the others, right? So, in this sense, the United States remains one of a number of global powers, but may very well be the only one that still has a presence throughout the entire world. Whereas Russia has its spheres of influence in one place, China in another, Iran in a smaller, location here. This also gives us pause, however, to think that rising powers are particularly not necessarily the most democratic. So there is one other thing to maybe take caution here, and that is the decline of America's global presence is also potentially synonymous with the decline of American liberal international order. And that is one of the reasons why we see a number of countries around the world today either struggling to maintain democracy or opt for some kind of illiberal, non-democratic political system. Countries, relatively regional, like Hungary or Poland, to a lesser extent, the Czech Republic or Serbia, Turkey, they are engaging in some type of, quasi-illiberal democratic, system here in which political rights and civil liberties are not necessarily geared towards the rights of the individual, but more so in light of the collective whole of the group. Now, I don't want to deter too much away from this, but what this effectively means is that our concept of what democracy was, and the idea that liberal democracy is really the pinnacle of political evolution, right? So just sort of this Francis Fukuyama understanding of the end of history has certainly been challenged. And because rising powers in the world today, like China and Russia, regional powers like Iran, are certainly nowhere near democratic, what we find is that global powers today may very well influence the developing world through mechanisms in diplomacy that don't necessarily prioritize democracy. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why many pundits in the United States had looked at Donald Trump's whole America First model as sort of indicative of the withdrawal of American post-war international commitments and leadership, right? The United States had effectively abandoned its interests in places like the Balkans, had sort of disengaged largely from its commitments in the Middle East, still maintained good diplomatic relations with, key countries like the United Kingdom and Israel, but had sort of wafted, sort of wavered, within its unflinching commitment and alliances with Western Europe, right? Particularly Germany and France. So, in this sense, the United States remains a global power, but no longer that type of ideologically committed power that it projected itself as in the immediate years following the Second World War, and within the first decade and a half of the age of globalization. So, with all of that said, it probably stands to reason to look at what exactly is or was Pax Americana. Pax Americana, if you kind of know the Latin, is really the sense of American peace. And it's a euphemistic term that was taken on the same understandings as the old historical Pax Romana and sort of the 19th century Pax Britannia, right? This idea that there is a major power in the known world at the time that has a significant amount of influence, ideological, economic, military, cultural. It is the power that not only dominates the system, but shapes the system within its own image, right? Within its own likeness. So Pax Americana was, a term that was applied to the American-led and American-defended sense of peace, stability, and development between North America and Western Europe since 1945, and much later towards the rest of the world after 1990. Right. So Pax Americana is largely seen as something that begins with the Marshall Plan. It was that period immediately following the Second World War in which the United States didn't so much lend money to reconstructing countries in Western Europe, but practically gave it to them. I practically gave them the money to just be like, this is seed capital to clear away the rubble, rebuild, modernize your economy, and get back on track with trading with us. And this was largely instrumental in laying the foundations for what would become a number of transatlantic military, economic, and political alliances. We can see them today still within the presence of NATO, the foundations of what lead to the European Union, especially also this understanding of the United Nations. The United States was instrumental in looking at the United Nations and seeing it as an organization of global governance, which uses American power to spread ideas of human rights, international law, democracy and development, and the sense of human collective welfare as a way of providing collective security and sort of collective benefits towards all members. And this sort of had taken on more of a global aspect in the late 90s, early 2000s with the age of globalization. And, I teach a class on globalization for many, many years, both at Rutgers and elsewhere, in which, globalization under American auspices is really the way of spreading transnational economic integration, right? These are things connected to liberalist principles of commercial pacifism and democratic peace theory. Commercial pacifism is a very simple way of saying that no two countries that are economically interdependent with each other go to war. Democratic peace theory takes that one step further and says no two democracies go to war with each other, right? So it stands to reason. The more countries economically are interconnected, and the more that countries are democratic ideologically, the less likely that war will break out. And this proved to be a resounding success within the transatlantic alliances between North America, the United States, and Canada, and Western Europe, particularly West Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia. And to that, we can also add what I call the Anglo-Saxon Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. Now, adding another 20 years to this, here we are in 2020, we ask ourselves, is this, reminiscent of, global peace or global hegemony? Because in many situations, challengers to this system can look at America's global presence and see it as a way of providing a type of inclusive ideology, but still maintaining, right, American political, military, economic, and diplomatic leverage over everyone else. That is probably the reason why it is inevitable that new powers will rise. It is not that the United States will continue indefinitely to remain this global superpower. And within the literature of international relations, it is usually common for us to divide the degree of power alignments into three broad categories. The first one is what we would call a bipolar political system. And this was defined largely by the two major powers during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. Two countries, for the most part, had the same military, diplomatic capabilities around the world. Certainly with military deterrence, both countries having nuclear weapons kept both countries from going to war. But it really was one country existed with its allies to counterbalance that of the others. The Pax Americana that we've been talking about is indicative of a term called unipolarity, which exists, but not all that often in world history. A unipolar system in which there is one country that has all the power, all the wealth, all the clout. It doesn't happen often, and it doesn't last that long. But I'm being very generous here in sort of giving a timeline to this. I would say 1990 to really 2021, I think the final nail in the coffin was America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the sense of Pax Americana was the world was created, shaped, molded, directed, really within the mindset and the ideology that is the United States. So that leaves us with the last one. And that is where I'm arguing we are today, this sense of multipolarity, in which there are anywhere from 3 to 5 countries that have influence, global influence around the world. Right? It's what we could really call the post-American world, which it's hard to say when it really begins. Some would say 2016 with the election of Donald Trump and the advent of the America First ideology of foreign policy. But it is one in which the United States continues to predominate, right? The United States is still a major power in the world, but just with diminished status, capability, reach, influence, and leadership. So who are the other countries, right? Who are the other players within this new global alignment? I don't think anybody would argue that China is the uncontested number 2, right? China is a major rising power, economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily as well. But China is, in my opinion, still happy to kind of be in second place, right? China's happy to take the back seat. Right? China is happy to kind of play it quiet while it builds up its own areas of influence, not through military bases, but really through major infrastructural developmental agreements with countries. But as it does this, spreading its economic reach throughout Asia, Europe, and Africa, it is clearly putting a comparative challenge to the continued presence of the United States. Now, there might be a number of other countries that I could say are sort of, tied for number 3. Russia, clearly a major power, not as influential, certainly not as globally prominent as China. But Russia under Vladimir Putin has certainly reversed the trend of decline in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the Middle East, it's always a toss-up between whether it's going to be Saudi Arabia or Iran. I put my money on Iran for a number of reasons. Number one, Iran has far more of a permanence within the region. Saudi Arabia is a large power, but it's a power that is largely dependent on the continued support of the United States. Iran is more of a standalone country, and one in which other countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel align and balance against. Germany is certainly a regional power within Europe, although Germany definitely plays more so a key role within the European Union. And India, we can't forget about India also as a regional power, right? And again, for the most part, most people agree United States, China, Russia as the 3 big ones. Other countries certainly function within a particular region as a power or as just a predominant country. To this, I would also add, and this is somewhat unorthodox because normally we look at countries. I would throw in international organizations at this point as well. The United Nations for sure, and also the European Union. But let me stick with the United Nations. The United Nations is certainly not what we would call a power like that of the Americans or the Chinese. but it's an increasingly influential international organization that might not have the authority to implement anything, but it has the credibility, it has the ideological legitimacy among large swaths of the world to tackle these global issues that I discussed, like COVID, climate change, global terrorism, human rights, minority issues, the depletion of natural resources like water, oil, and others, right? So this leads us with, a number of big questions. And these are things that we can maybe talk about in the Q&A. I have a few hypotheses to offer. It's still relatively early in the game to, make any definitive predictions, but there's three questions that I have here. Number one, is the end of Pax Americana attributed to any one incident, right? One president, one particular moment? And I ask this question because as America's global presence is on the comparative decline, right? It's noted within the media, right? Journalism, newspapers, talk shows, and depending upon what you read or who you listen to on TV, they're likely to point the finger at one person or another. Right now, Fox News is, apparently just losing its mind that Biden is, just weakening America almost, intentionally. Whereas, existing analysis has looked at rather critically at Donald Trump's America First platform and said that, it was he that was instrumental in disengaging from the world and sort of sullying our existing relations with a number of countries around the world. Some would even go so far as to say that America's image began to be tarnished as early as 20 years ago, when George W. Bush decided to preemptively strike Iraq in the name of, defending us from global terrorism or making the connection with 9/11. To that, I have a second question. Will President Biden adhere to more international multilateralism, or will he continue with Trump's America First model? And so I don't know how many of you had a chance to listen to President Biden speak at the UN General Assembly just this past Tuesday. If you didn't listen to this speech, you can read the transcript. At least on paper, right? Biden is saying, America is not first, America is back. America is engaging the world again, multilaterally. We will use diplomacy over the military. We will work with our international partners. We will re-engage the world. We will re-engage our commitments to a number of issues that we seemingly detached ourselves from under Donald Trump. And so with that said, is Trump really a speed bump? Was he really just a hiccup? What will the world look like in 2030, right? Will we re-engage the world as a major power? Or by 2030, will the United States be a major cooperative player along with other countries, chief of which are China, Russia, to a lesser extent, Iran and India? When we think about maybe Latin America, certainly we cannot discount the presence of maybe Brazil. So, as I've said in the, sort of in the abstract of this speech, the United States has to, cooperate with at least one other country to get what it wants in the world today. And that doesn't necessarily mean that America's strength has weakened. It just simply means that the era of American unipolarism is no longer guaranteed. It is no longer recognized by other countries around the world. And as such, the United States needs to work and cooperate on a multilateral level. So this gives us pause for a little good news and bad news, right, about Pax Americana's ending. First thing that I've noticed is that Pax Americana was destined to end, right, regardless of Obama, Trump, or Biden, right? If you kind of think about counterfactual history here, let's just say that Trump didn't win in 2016, but rather it was Hillary Clinton. Would the United States be anything different than it was under Donald Trump? And obviously that's, an open-ended question here. But it's hard to say that the United States would be really any relatively stronger or weaker. On one level, Trump didn't invade another country. He certainly, ratcheted up the rhetoric with countries like, North Korea and elsewhere. But we didn't escalate our, attempt at establishing a foothold in Syria. We didn't expand our counterterrorist measures throughout Africa. We kind of left that to the French. So, beyond the ideology, beyond the individual that is in the White House, unipolar theory gives us pause to think that these things operate really on a limited time, simply because new powers are inevitable to rise. So Russia, China, Iran, they all would have continued to rise in strength and stature, regardless of whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, regardless of whether Joe Biden won in 2020, or whether Donald Trump had gotten a second term, right? The world would have effectively looked the same, give or take a few, specific nuances here. So that is actually good news for those that are worried about the decline of America's global presence, because we still will remain a major global power for the indefinite future. Don't get me wrong on that, right? The United States is not receding into some secondary irrelevant power, right? In fact, as I mentioned beforehand, the United States may remain really the only true global power amid a number of regional powers. So in other words, China's got its area, Central Asia, certainly the former areas of the former Soviet Union, Southeast Asia. But the United States is there. Russia has its sphere, the near abroad, the Balkans, here and there, the Middle East. The United States still there. Iran has its presence in the Middle East, specifically over Iraq and parts of Lebanon and Syria. But the United States is still there as well. So in that sense, the United States has just simply ceased to be a superpower and has kind of taken one step back to being a global power, certainly a number of regional powers as well. The other thing to understand is that the world will largely remain made in America's design. So the major challenger to America's global stature is China. But Chinese foreign policy, when it doesn't involve Taiwan, isn't interested in ideology, right? We tend to think, yes, China is still it is still officially a communist country. But the last time that China really cared about international Marxism was, I guess, sometime back in the 70s. So if China is going to exercise its global presence around the world, it's going to be using the same models of market capitalism and industrialism that, was predicated by the United States. So the United States is not contending really ideologically unless they're interested in, competing with democracy versus some type of economic corporatism coming from China or Russia. More to the point, though, is that Russia, more so than China, has indicated that they are absolutely committed to the principles of international global governance. Now, you can take that at face value, or you can say that this is just, a rhetorical ruse. But Russian foreign policy seems to be one in which they are adhering to some principles of international law that are set forth by the United Nations, and in that case, have been largely designed and written by the United States. So if the United States is going to engage in this type of multilateral diplomacy, then it doesn't matter what the ideologies of these other countries are, so much as they can be seen as strategic partners for regional stability and security in areas in which Washington and Moscow or Beijing overlap. So in that sense, when we look at the discrepancies, the differences between America is back under Biden and America first under Donald Trump, it's really just rhetoric, because in many cases, the slogans may seem like they're polar opposites, right? But American foreign policy, whether it's Biden or Trump or Obama or any of the Bushes or Clinton or whoever else afterwards usually defaults into a methodology that prioritizes America's national interest first. So, we can talk about America being back, but then we ask ourselves, why did we seem to so unilaterally and haphazardly withdraw from Afghanistan? When it became known that the Taliban were at the gates of Kabul, should we have stopped? Should we have turned around and said, no, we need to stay? Knowing the consequences, knowing the fallout. Biden seems pretty committed to saying that he's perfectly happy with the pullout and is sort of restructuring the narrative to say that we achieved our goal in Afghanistan to begin with by eliminating al-Qaeda, which seems to just, overlook and completely dismiss 20 years of nation building, democratic development, providing some support to nascent civil society movements here. That seems to be more of America first than America is back, right? When we talk about America's engagement around the world, it doesn't matter whether it's Biden or Trump or anyone else. Unfortunately, we still engage in policies of selective diplomacy in which we will lament human rights abuses in parts of the world if and only if these abuses are being committed by states that are not allies of us. So we can lament, right, the plight of the Uyghurs in China or the Rohingya in Myanmar, but we tend to overlook the plight of political, ethnic, or religious minorities that are being targeted directly by governments that are strategic allies of us. That seems to be more America first than really America is back. Another thing, if some of you have been paying attention to the news here, is that yes, the United States has been engaged in policies of multilateral cooperation over the past week or so, especially when it comes to China. And this sort of weird acronym, I don't know how you would call this, AUKUS or whatever. It's this military, this naval alliance between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. I like to think that Australia is AU, UK, and of course the United States gets its own separate, initials. Australia and the United Kingdom share the U here. It's a way of providing naval deterrence to China's growing perceived presence in the South and East China Seas. In this sense, this is not so much multilateralism globally, but certainly good old-fashioned balance of power politics that views China as a rival rather than as a partner, right? So with all of that said, and I want to leave enough time here for some comments, and I'm happy to expand and get a bit more specific here or there, but when we ask ourselves, where is the United States going at the end of Pax Americana, in a way, the US isn't really going anywhere. It hasn't left the playing field. It is just simply being joined by a number of other rising powers, right? It's really putting an end to the definitive notion of any kind of pax in American global diplomatic hegemony. So it is clearly a return to multilateralism, okay? And in this sense, it is not really the idea that the United States is breaking away from any kind of aggressive foreign policy so much as it is admitting it no longer has that clout, right? All major powers throughout history have their moments of ascendancy and periods of decline. And we are in that right now. It is a subtle acceptance of our reduced power and influence, but one in which we could take a step back and pragmatically accept the realities of a multipolar system, which may very well be the reason why Biden is getting so much criticism from some more, patriotic, nationalistic, sources here in the United States, because it's seen as Biden is abrogating, right, abandoning America's global leadership position. In reality, he's not really doing anything different from Trump, who saw this as well. But whereas Trump wanted to kind of pull everybody back, build up some walls and say, I'm powerful here and you guys over there, you're on your own. Biden, if there's any major difference, is realizing America's reduced capability, but understanding that we can still be a global power if and only if, right, we work with other countries in the world as well. So in other words, it is no longer America's way or the highway. It is America is once again putting together a number of strategic alliances, cooperative frameworks, and methods of understanding. And depending upon what we're looking at, right? If it's an economic thing, the United States may definitely work more with China. If it's a military thing, we're going to work more with Australia and the UK, maybe even Japan, in deterring Chinese influence. So in this sense, there is a lot of specifics to going on here, but the United States has certainly understood that the age of American unipolarism is gone, and the best situation to make now is to re-engage the world multilaterally. Right? But with that said, I'm happy to open the floor up to any discussion, and I'd be curious to see what you all have to think. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. So we'll get started. We had some pre-submitted questions while the questions from current attendees get started. So you think I know you touched on this, but I want to, since someone did ask a question, do you think that our political climate is affecting China's ability to perhaps become a major global power, become the major global power with the US moving to second? I know you said that it's not going to happen, but do you think the political climate is adding to that?
You can say yes or no to that. The easiest way to answer that is that there is no country out there that really has the capability of preventing another country from rising to whatever levels of power that it wants. But be that as it may, right? The understanding that China is a rising power, and the understanding also that for years, we have been reading about how at some point China is going to surpass the United States as a larger economy, certainly creates a number of sirens within policymaking, political and pundit circles here in the United States. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we respond? Within the theory of unipolarism, it's never envious to be in that position when you as the superpower are now declining. And there's a couple of ways that you can respond to this. You can take the pragmatic approach and realize that this is just inevitable and look at China or any other country for that matter as a potential partner, as a potential client for cooperation. Or you can kind of flail around and you can kind of try to look for any and all defensive mechanisms, kicking, screaming, adding, certain protectionist measures against Chinese imports or military presence within the region as a way of not preventing China from ascending to where it is, but maybe delaying it. The only trouble is that when unipolar powers seem to act more aggressive in response to their decline, that's perceived around the world as that country looking and acting more belligerent, sometimes even more careless in that sense. Now, how China responds to that is really up to the Chinese leadership. But regardless of whatever we may feel within political circles here, I don't think that other than creating points of discussion or narratives of understanding how the world works, is that going to have any real bearing on what China does or doesn't do?
Okay, sort of in line with that, someone asked, do you think befriending Iran, which might hurt our Israeli relations, is the right move to take on China's rise in power, or should we remain neutral?
So, the closest that we got in terms of engaging Iran is the nuclear non-proliferation deal that was brokered in the Obama administration under John Kerry as Secretary of State. I will say this was probably the best outreach that the United States had given to Iran since the Iranian Revolution. There's always these subjective consequences that come along with the United States suddenly 180ing to countries that we have stigmatized. So it's natural that there's going to be some reactionary blowback if the United States suddenly starts cooperating with Iran, which is seen by many as a terrorist state, which is very similar in scope to the United States taking a pragmatic solution to a country like Cuba and realizing it's not going anywhere. We might as well engage with Cuba, but then run the risk among, again, certain circles as us catering to communists, which is ironic because China is communist as well, but we have no problem working with them. The thing with Iran is, again, this is my opinion. This is my own opinion, which people can take one way or the other. There is no risk in re-engaging with Iran. We don't have to be friends with them. We know that we are ideologically on two opposite ends of the spectrum, but there's evidence to show that during that period under Obama's tenure, that the nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Iran was producing positive results. Iran was complying, and this is the best part, the United States was working with Germany, Great Britain, Russia, and France. It was a multilateral cooperative initiative. This was not a one-to-one sense of agreement here. So Iran was working with the rest of the world, major powers, to comply in return for having most of its overseas foreign accounts unfrozen, which provides enormous cash flow to a country that in many cases is desperate for it. So when that was scuttled by Donald Trump, that had less to do with America assuming a greater sense of prominence in the Middle East, in my opinion, so much as it was catering to certain groups that felt like we shouldn't deal with the enemy.
Can you comment on the Belt and Road Initiative, and will it backfire as countries realize the burden that it creates?
That's an interesting thing. See, right now, China's foreign policy is in ascendancy. And for many countries that take part in the Belt and Road Initiative, everyone loves China's economic and industrial investment, right? Because China just comes with a large wad of cash. They don't care what your ideology is. They don't care what your government is. China only cares really about one thing. It's a euphemistic thing that I mention all the time, but it's important. Before China deals with you, they ask, what's your position on Taiwan? And if your position is Taiwan is not a country, it's a disputed territory, China will work with you 24/7. With the Belt and Road Initiative, it is effectively a way of creating really a major, transcontinental highway and, merchant marine system here. It's China's attempt at creating this economic free trade zone that, eliminates as many barriers as possible. But China also has that image about it that it provides hard industrial investment to cash-strapped countries, and it puts a lot of these countries on the global map. One of the big issues here is that Central Asia, right, the STAN countries, are those that benefit the most from it. The United States, for the most part, had little to no influence in Central Asia. And as far as Russia is concerned, Central Asia is just, the backdoor appendage of what used to be the Soviet Union. China, on the other hand, approaches these countries and looks at them infrastructurally. And for many of these countries that have been either overlooked by the United States or conditioned by the United States to do X, Y, and Z in return for some kind of investment, China appears to be much more easy to work with. And because China is seen as that rising power to counter American diplomatic presence within the region, China right now is, riding on a far more popular marketing branding image of itself.
Okay, switching gears, what do you think about the future of the US's foreign fossil fuel dependencies with recent US foreign policy actions? In the short term, what message does Build Back Better Energy send to the Middle East?
So, on one level, this is definitely a problem for Biden, and to a larger extent for Democrats, who feel much more prone, more attached to the idea of eventual detachment from fossil fuels and the embrace of green energy. Biden, particularly is someone that is not ready to, completely cut the cord. But there seems to be this understanding that before we completely eliminate our dependency on fossil fuels, we're going to rely on our own supply first, which means that we're going to roll back our dependency on Saudi oil, in particular. That's the rhetorical. The reality is that if it is perceived that economic withdrawal from key countries like Saudi Arabia might risk destabilizing the country, we will maintain whatever economic links are necessary to keep the country afloat. Because at the end of the day, the understanding of a weakened, fragmented, potentially collapsing Saudi Arabia could be catastrophically disastrous, not just economically speaking for global supply of oil, but the idea that the alternatives, the political and ideological alternatives coming to power in Saudi Arabia, now they can't get really any more authoritarian than what we currently have, but they're certainly going to be far less likely to work with the United States, far less likely to cooperate with Washington. So this now becomes a security issue. So on one level, we realize that fossil fuel dependency is heating up the planet. On another level, completely eliminating this right now runs the risk of destabilizing countries that are and have been potentially unstable for years. In that regard, it might be, and again, this is just a hypothetical muse right now, is getting many of these petroleum producing Gulf states to start using the investment, start using the revenue that they have accumulated over the years through the price of oil within their rentier money towards investment within alternative energy, green energy, wind energy. If there is that way of making that transition with these regimes and these alliances remaining as they are, the United States might be more likely to work with that disengagement of fossil fuels. But until that time, fossil fuel dependency provides the money to keep these governments in power, and by that means keep the security at least status quo.
Okay. What role does the United Nations play in multilateralism?
So, United Nations is a weird thing because on one level, the United Nations has what I like to call global street credibility, right? The United Nations has a large amount of legitimacy by increasingly a large number of people, just simply because the UN is really the only international organization that we have that has the leverage to address such issues as healthcare crises, global warming, global terror, human rights, rights for minorities and women, all the other things that we've been talking about. The problem is that the UN was never set up to be anything other than an organization for global governance, right? The UN gets a lot of criticism for being ineffectual. The reality is that the UN was never established to do anything other than raise awareness. The UN is not a global government in the making, right? We are not in my lifetime, not in the lifetime of many of the people in the audience here today, is it going to become a world government. So in this sense, the UN's role is really to provide that normative set of beliefs that influence the ways in which people who run countries like the United States should operate. So a really good example of this is that, when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, and the reasoning behind it was, it hurts the economy. We don't want to be engaged, and we don't want to have any other international organization sort of tell us what to do. The biggest criticism of this was that you're pulling out of an agreement that the United States already signed. But not only that, it's for global environmentalism. Like, why would you want to pull out of that? The United Nations has that ability of raising a number of points that resonates with a large number of people. And so when we talk about multilateralism in that sense, the United Nations really, in my opinion, can serve as that neutral mediating ground, especially for a number of regional powers like the United States, China, and Russia, maybe even Iran, that have different ideological assessments of the world, their own agendas and national interests, but they all agree, right? They all agree that, pandemic problems, global warming, and other issues need to be solved. And if they can't be solved by one country, the UN can at least provide that coordinating perspective, that coordinating field of having countries like them find common ground and work together. The UN cannot implement, right? The UN cannot execute. The UN can only suggest, but it can create suggestions that put a lot of pressure on countries to make good on these, on these goals and promises.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Someone said, Biden's words during his UN speech, "I stand here today for the first time in 20 years with the US not at war. We've turned the page." Seems like a bold statement, no?
Yeah, it's a way of getting people's attention. I stand here, first time in 20 years, the United States has not been at war. I mean, at what cost? I think of that as it is the last question. And at the risk of being a little bit less academic, I'm reminded of that SpongeBob meme where, he's standing in front of a burned out city and he says, "We did it, we saved the city." So, in this sense, it's like, yeah, we're not at war. I mean, well, when you pull out of conflict, there's not like conflict has been resolved. It's not like Afghanistan has been pacified. You just don't have troops over there. So it's a nice statement to make, but I wouldn't necessarily say that war is something that the United States has now suddenly divorced itself from. We have to remember, say what you want about Donald Trump, but Trump did not start another war in his 4 years. In a weird way of looking at this, Trump may have been belligerent. He may have been not the most diplomatic person on the planet, but he was, comparatively speaking, one of the most pacifistic presidents in terms of our military presence around the world. So, again, it's a nice statement to make, and it's a good way of starting out the speech.
One last thing, someone said aside, because you had mentioned that you have a YouTube channel, they were interested, do you have videos on there about the Cold War?
Yes, I do. Okay. They can look in the playlist on international relations. There's a class that I taught at Rutgers back in 2015. And there, I think, are 1 or 2 lectures there that talk about the Cold War, balance of power, nuclear deterrence, all sorts of good stuff.
Great. All right, it's 1 o'clock on the dot. This was great. I would like to thank you for taking your time and sharing this talk with us today. Everyone who attended will get a follow-up survey. We love to get feedback, ideas for future speakers. We will send you the link for this video, so if you would like to share it with anybody, you can. We have an event next week with another Rutgers alum, Richard Rossi, who will be presenting the future of commerce, exploring e-commerce and looking ahead. As always, we always keep the events, the future events on the School of Arts and Sciences events website. And yeah, thank you. I think anything else, any parting words?
Any parting words? I hope that the sirens, got to where they were trying to get to. It seemed like at one point it was pretty bad. It sounded pretty bad out there, but I don't see any smoke, and it's all quiet now on Flatbush Ave.
There you go. I didn't hear any during the presentation. I heard some before we started, but I didn't really hear anything during the talk. Okay,
that's good. That's good. Well, I want to thank everyone who attended, and I want to thank you, Dana, for helping me put this together. I think this was a really great experience, and I'd be happy to do one of these again in the near future.
All right. Sounds good to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.